You're listening to Decisive Point, a U.S. Army War College Press production focused on national security affairs. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the authors and are not necessarily those of the Department of the Army, the U.S. Army War College, or any other agency of the U.S. government. I'm talking with Professor Luke P. Bellocchi, author of The Strategic Importance of Taiwan to the United States and its Allies, Part 1, which was published in the summer 2023 issue of Parameters. Bellocchi served in senior and senior executive positions throughout his government career and is now an associate professor of practice at National Defense University. He's lived throughout Asia for more than 10 years. Welcome to Decisive Point.
Hi, Stephanie. Thank you for having me.
What inspired you to take on the question of why the United States should care about Taiwan?
I kept on going to these conferences on China, and there has been, within the military circles, a lot more interest about Taiwan, especially since the invasion of Ukraine. There's been some focus here, and the fact that China now is our peer competitor and is recognized as such within strategy documents throughout the U.S. government. Every time I went to these conferences and the issue of Taiwan came up, the same question came up over and over again. That was, why should we care about this little island compared to China's population? It has about 24 million people. We've got enough troubles just maintaining our alliances with the Philippines and Japan and South Korea. Why take on this new burden? I'd better organize some thoughts. Sometimes the answer to that question would be, well, U.S. credibility among our allies. I guess that was implied. And I thought, well, that is an important issue, but it isn't the only issue. I decided, let's put this down on paper, organize some thoughts about what is important. Let the audience decide. At least give them 4 good fundamental factors to consider.
And your paper does give compelling reasons about why we should care. Let's start with what's important about Taiwan's location.
Militarily, geopolitically, Taiwan is important because it's called the first island chain, which is an island chain just off the coast of China. But more importantly, it sits right in between our 2 major allies, Japan and the Philippines. And a lot of people forget that when Pearl Harbor was attacked, movies are made about Pearl Harbor, but on the same day, Japan, which occupied Taiwan at the time, launched their invasion of the Philippines from Taiwan. And in fact, Japanese Zeros attacked Clark Air Force Base. And so it is an important launching point should China control Taiwan to places like the Philippines. And I'm sure the Philippine government is quite aware of that. Control by China of Taiwan would create a wedge between these 2 important allies, Japan and the Philippines as well. More importantly, as China is building their blue water fleet and they want to break out into the open ocean, they're going to have a difficult time bypassing this first island chain, which is a bunch of islands stemming from the main islands of Japan, a bunch of smaller islands, the Senkakus or Ryukyu Islands, Taiwan, and then the Philippine chain of islands. Because there's so many obstacles in the way, unlike our own coastline on the west or east coast, China's blue water fleet would have to bypass all this. Now, if they control Taiwan, of course, they could bypass the first island chain and they could break out into the open ocean very easily. There is something called the second island chain, and it's composed of the Commonwealth, Northern Marianas Islands, Saipan, Guam, and so forth, but it is a lot more porous and harder to quote-unquote defend. So geographically, on a military scale, it is a very important location. There are other reasons you might think that geographically it's important because of commerce, which is my second big reason why one should consider Taiwan important. The Taiwan Strait is where about 88% of the largest commercial container fleets go through every year. We're talking about trillions of dollars. If they had to go around Taiwan, let's say in a blockade, or if China blockaded the Taiwan Straits or Taiwan itself, it would have a huge impact on the supply lines. It would back up commerce for weeks. And also, the east coast of Taiwan has a lot of cyclones, about 20 cyclones a year. There was an important study by the Mercatus Center looking at costs with regard to shipping in the Black Sea because of the Ukraine war. They concluded that just the insurance costs alone, every additional day that they would have to be at sea would cost 1% to 2%. It would be like a 1% to 2% tariff on whatever they're carrying. A week delay in shipping not only would back up supply chains, but it would be the equivalent of a 14% tariff on shipping those goods. Those are at least 2 reasons that Taiwan is important.
What would losing Taiwan's democracy mean for America's credibility with its allies?
First, Taiwan is a self-made democracy. It wasn't something that was created at the barrel of a gun or something like that. It was self-actualized. Taiwan's democracy is very vibrant. They've changed governing political parties multiple times. And in fact, the current government is led by President Tsai Ing-wen, who is a pro-independence party member. In other words, she really wants or advocates for Taiwan to declare its independence formally. It's been de facto an independent nation for about 70 years since the end of World War II. It has not been recognized by the UN or many other countries. Of course, its official language is still Mandarin, which is the same language on mainland China. Its media, soap operas, pop stars, what have you, do have an influence on mainland Chinese just on a social level. And they do see that in Taiwan, they're able to choose their own leadership, hold them to account if things go wrong, if there's corruption and things like that. And that has an underlying influence. You could say it's a gray zone influence on the Chinese people. I think it's very important. Taiwan remains a beacon of democracy, especially after what they've seen in Hong Kong and the suppression of democracy there. You could argue a Chinese-based society that has chosen a democratic and free way of life. And so democracy itself, it's a little different than broadcasting, let's say, democracy from Japan or the US, because it's not in their own language. And it's not, you could argue, in their own culture and so forth. So for those reasons, I think Taiwan's beacon of democracy is important for changing the way Chinese people see things and govern themselves. That goes in line with America's credibility with its allies. It is challenging out there in the neighborhood of China as China is growing stronger and stronger. Their economy is really sucking in a lot of Japan, South Korea, the Philippines economy into their economic orbit. That the U.S. has credibility that it will maintain freedom of the seas, freedom of navigation, and a free way of life. If Taiwan were to be absorbed by the PRC, I think there would be some doubts. Now, Japan has already announced that they would double their military spending. Other actions, I think, since especially the Ukraine war, because of Russian authoritarianism expansion, they're very much worried that China will take advantage in the same way, expand its territory, especially into Taiwan. There have been other challenges in the South China Sea and so forth. And as I mentioned before, they're growing a larger and larger blue water fleet. And in fact, by some accounts, their Navy is bigger than the U.S. is now. There is some worry out there that the U.S. will not be able to maintain order in the way that they expect and freedom in the way they expect. So they're looking very closely at what happens with Taiwan. And that way, America's credibility is being challenged.
This is part of a two-part series. Just for this piece, we need to wrap it up, and I'm curious, do you have any concluding thoughts that you'd like to share before we go?
Yes, part one, as I mentioned, really is to answer the question, those military and national security folks who may be not as familiar with the Indo-Pacific area and ask the question why we really should care about Taiwan. And I tried to answer that in part one in an organized way. I think that at conferences, the experts are fully aware of these 4 factors that I give, but I've never seen organized on paper. Here are the reasons. That's what I'm trying to do with part one. Part two was to look at the strategic importance of Taiwan, especially after the start of the Ukraine war, and how it's changed in national security documents and in statements. As you may be aware, President Biden 4 times has said that we have a commitment to defend Taiwan in some form or other. The first time, of course, everyone said, oh, that was a gaffe. And in fact, George W. Bush said the same thing once, and they thought it was a gaffe. But after 4 times, you kind of think, yeah, maybe it isn't so much of a gaffe, that there's something a little more to it. And I look at the national security strategy, the latest one that came out, and Taiwan is mentioned 7 times. So I analyzed the 7 mentions and what's changed and what hasn't. One of the biggest things is that the U.S. is calling on European powers to maintain the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, which is another way of saying that Europe should be helping defend Taiwan from any aggression from China. If you want to hear about the rest of the analysis, please read part 2.
Listeners, there are plenty of details to be had in this article, and it'll set you up perfectly for the one that's coming out. You can find it at press.armywarcollege.edu/parameters. Look for volume 53, issue 2. Professor Bellocchi, thank you so much for making time to speak with me today.
Thank you so much, Stephanie.
If you enjoyed this episode of Decisive Point and would like to hear more, you can find us on any major podcast platform.